core topic in any ethics course is a discussion of ethical decision making, so this session seeks to provide an introduction to the subject. If we're going to discuss how to make ethical decisions, it suggests that we want to do two things. It suggests that we want to make the process conscious, so that we seek to observe and articulate what's going on, and that we want our decisions to be appropriate. Now, the word appropriate is not a weak word here. It's a personal word. It means that you determine what you think is appropriate in the situation. So you establish your standards that you hold yourself to. That's the purpose of the word appropriate here. So in this session we're going to look at a few different aspects of making ethical decisions. First of all, we'll establish some context by looking at decisions in distinction to relationships. You'll see what we mean in a moment. Then we'll take a bit more time to consider the context for decisions. You need to set out a process for making ethical decisions so that you've got a process that you think through, but you also need to give attention to the criteria on which you're going to base your decisions, which involves both general principles and particular values. Then I want to look at decisions in the light of routine situations where scripts might be involved, where the idea of decisions is not so much in the foreground. And this involves the roles that we might hold in particular situations as well. So I'll be looking at how you use this process model in practice. Before we delve into the decision-making process itself, let's just say something about relationships. When you're in a situation, there's some kind of task or decision that may need to be taken, which will have direct effects, but you are also embedded in a web of relationships, so that your decision and your action may have an effect in itself, a direct effect, but it will also have an effect on the nature of your relationships with the people around you. So that you might do something that you think is the appropriate or competent or effective thing to do, but it will have an effect on your relationship with the people around you. It may serve to build or maintain those relationships, or it may damage them. And that in itself affects what's possible in the future. And it may also, harming a relationship may also cause harm to the person. If, for example, a person depends on you and you damage the trust between you because of doing something that you thought you should do, then that becomes an extra consideration in your decision-making process. So let's keep this in mind when we go on to talk about the actual process of making decisions. Keep relationships in mind. The first thing we need to do when we look at a situation that involves an ethics issue is to consider the context. And what do we mean by that? The broadest thing you can imagine. We need to consider everything that we think might be relevant, from what's immediate to what might be further afield. We need to consider the different stakeholders who have some stake in the situation and what their perspectives might be, how they see the ethics of the situation, how they see the consequences for them. Then we need to take a step backwards again and consider our very perceptions, because our observing of the world is not neutral. It's influenced by our experiences in the past. It's influenced by our role in the situation. It's influenced by everything in our background. So that you just have to think of how someone else might see the same situation and how they might see it differently to understand the impact that perceptions have. Because once we've defined a situation, we're pretty much halfway towards deciding what we can and can't do about it. So our perceptions are very important. Then, in considering the context, we'd want to make provision for how the situation affects us personally, and in organisations we need to consider how the situation is going to affect the organisation and how the organisation is seen, and we need to consider what's possible in the situation, because often there are constraints on what we can do, and there may be opportunities for us to do things. So we need to consider all of these things in determining the context. This is a diagram of the decision-making process. Most of it should be apparent. Presented with a situation or a problem, you undertake a decision-making process, which there will be a number of steps, and you will come to a decision and perform some action as a result. Often in decision-making models that are presented in books, this is what is discussed, and there's not much emphasis given to the other parts of this diagram. There's actually not much thought given to the ethical criteria that are used, or if it's a management model, whatever management criteria are used. So that is not discussed, but we will, because people have all sorts of different ethical criteria that they use or don't use in coming to decisions. So it's a critical part of the process. So we need to identify ethical criteria separately, and by which we mean we're talking about the principles, the general principles by which we use in coming to decisions, and what values we hold to. We also need to consider the psychological aspects. Now you might think this is irrelevant, but if we remember that whatever we do in the middle has to result in an action, then the psychological aspects are important, because they affect or can affect what we're prepared to do, and they affect us in terms of how other people might react to what we do. So I think that both the ethical criteria and the psychological aspects of decision making need to be considered, as well as the actual process. So we need to have a process. We need to have a sensible, rational series of steps that we go through in order to come to a decision. This model lays out the process in 10 steps. It should present you as being fairly logical. You formulate the problem, that's step 1. You define a goal or a solution, and you identify who the relevant stakeholders are, and then you identify what your decision criteria are and decide on the importance of those criteria. In the face of this, you start to develop different options. You analyze those options, and then you select an option. Finally, you implement the decision that you've made, and you evaluate that decision. This is a logical management kind of model. However, the rational model is not the only model of decision making. There are other models around, one of which we call the expert model, because it was derived through research into observation of experts. By experts we mean people who were skilled people who have to make decisions on the spot in the field. So for example, firefighters, policemen, nurses, doctors, pilots. These are all people who have developed particular expertise in their field, who are able to operate off the cuff in situations where you may not be sure what's happening, but you still have to make a decision and act on it. So, There are many researchers who have examined this area. One of them is Gary Klein, and he has a book called Sources of Power. And what I've presented here is a summary of what he's saying. He starts from the question, what's different about experts? What distinguishes them from novices? And these are the kinds of things that distinguish them. They see things that novices don't. So they're skilled at observation. And they look for patterns. They can look at what's happening in a situation and see patterns that they've developed from their previous experience that they have reflected upon. Given that, they can predict expectancies for situations, and they can see when it looks like what's happening is deviating from those patterns. They look at the situation holistically, so they establish an overall sense of the situation and its dynamics. They see the detail, but they look for the overall sense of the situation. Now I should cut in here to say that this is looking at the actions of experts in a wide range of fields. What I'm saying is that this kind of approach is just as much applicable to looking at ethical situations, or situations that require an ethical response. So to continue, an expert can understand the flow of events. They can look both backwards and they can project forwards, so they can get a sense of what's likely to happen. And within that, they maintain a sense of purpose and what goals are achievable in that situation. And that may change. If you think of the example of the firefighter, obviously they go to the fire expecting to put it out. Sometimes they come to a fire and realize that it's way beyond them, and that's no longer the achievable goal. The achievable goal is more about containment. So can you see that these are ideas that you can very well apply to situations involving ethics? So the essence of it is that the expert can act on the basis of recognizing patterns in a situation and making appropriate responses to that. So what's different about this from the rational approach? In the rational approach, you lay out all your options. You identify them, you write them down, and you lay them out, and then you compare all those options with each other and then decide which one of them you're going to choose. It seems that experts don't do that. They're not really sitting down saying, well, here's option 1, option 2, option 3. They're saying, I can see what's happening here. I can see the pattern of what's going on, and I know from experience that these are the kinds of responses that are appropriate and will achieve the desired effect. That's the difference. They're recognizing patterns. They're not listing options and weighing up the criteria. So what do they do in unprecedented situations? Well, the same thing. They're still looking for patterns. They're still looking for bits and pieces of patterns that will help them to determine the most effective response. So they're using their experience. If something's not quite the same, they're looking for parallels. They might have an idea that was an experience in one context, and they think, that might apply here. So they're doing all of that kind of mental work to come up with an appropriate response. So they trust their skills, but they're also aware of their limitations. And the last thing is that after it's over, they don't just go home and have a beer. They might, but they also always review what happened. They review the entire situation and they learn from it. Now, all of this is very much applicable to how you approach a decision that requires an ethical response. You saw my logical 10-step process before, the rational approach. This is the diagram that Gary Klein came up with after interviewing all of those experts. Somewhat different. I'm not going to go through all the elements in this diagram, but you'll see that the things that are easily highlighted there are the importance of experience, the importance of thinking and imagining what's going on, so you can look for what's going on underneath the surface, what's invisible, the dynamics. And a lot of that is captured over time through their storytelling, through reviewing an experience and all the dynamics of it, and evolving that into the stories that they remember about fires they've fought or babies they've saved, the particular things they noticed, the particular patterns that they saw at work. And in the same way, I'm suggesting this is an approach to ethical situations as well. So the obvious question, what do you do with two different approaches? One of them's rational, the other one's this intuitive expert approach. Well, I think they're both of value. I think you just have to think about the types of situations that you face. There are some situations that are fairly routine or at least non-critical. So they're the sorts of situations that you would expect to come across in the ordinary run of your work. And then there are the immediate crisis issues, where a decision has to be made right now. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are the policy kinds of issues. They're the issues that we do need to sit down and talk about and weigh up the options and consider what the consequences of each of the options are. So there's a kind of spectrum that runs from the immediate critical situation back through routine and semi-routine and the more pensive policy issues. And your approach to dealing with those situations can come from a mixture of the rational approach and the expert approach. And you can see that the rational approach is probably weighted more towards the issues where you've got time to ponder. Whereas the immediate crisis issues, you already need to know what you should be doing. And that's what makes you an expert in terms of ethics. I present this diagram because it says to me that yes, we are rational people, we can reason, and that's of value. We look at facts, we weigh them up. But there are also limits to rationality. Because in human situations, ethics is not just about facts, it's also about the entire human framework, the network that you are in the middle of, in a web. And to live in that web ethically, you need to give consideration to all of the things that are below the line there, below the observable line. You need to take into account people's motivations and their emotions. You need to take into account deeper things, like what are people's values in this situation, what are their needs, what are their ideologies in some situations. So I think it's always useful to keep this diagram in mind so you know that you are not just dealing with something that can be resolved rationally and through facts, because in the human situation all of these other things here are factors. So far we've looked at ethical decision making in a process way. These are the steps that you go through, either in the rational model or in the expert intuitive model. Those are the steps that you go through in a process sense. But as we saw earlier in that diagram, a decision-making model also requires criteria by which you will make decisions. And the entree into that is the idea of principles, that principles are a bit broader than values, so that they're things that we understand between ourselves, they come down to things like beliefs and accepted standards in a context, whether that's an organization or a society, so that these are pre-ethical things, but they govern the fact that as humans, and humans in particular contexts, we operate towards each other on the basis of certain assumptions. So you can think of them as being shared assumptions that people have. And then the other side of it, which we'll go to, is talking about values. So in this next section, we're looking at the heart of ethical decision making, because we're looking at the ethical criteria that you base your decision on. Now, in organisational contexts, the pressures are to follow those quasi-values on the top half of the screen there. We are pressured to put the organisation's interests at the forefront. So our first rule ought to be to maximise the organisation's benefit. The next thing is that we're also under pressure to follow standard operating procedures. And there are lots of reasons for following standard operating procedures, but we all know that there are times when that will lead to a harm or a detriment. And then the thinking person, the ethical person, will think twice and ask questions instead of just following. There's also pressure to go along with organisational politics. Who's powerful, who's important, who holds sway. And then at a personal level, there can be pressures to do what serves our own personal career goals. That's a pressure as well. And in the midst of all of that, we might think, okay, we'll have to compromise. We'll have to compromise between this and that, or we might cop out altogether. And organisations are structured that way so that people seek to avoid responsibility, and it's fairly easy to do a lot of the time. So that all of these pressures drive us towards taking the easy path and doing what will not cause any waves in the organisation. And that might sound horrible and alarmist, but bear in mind too that in the ordinary flow of things, most of the time ethics is not a huge issue. We all go about our daily jobs. The organisations that we work for are generally not trying to cause harm, and people have goodwill. So the situations I'm talking about here, where these pressures come into play, are the times when things are not so benign. That's all. Against those pressures, the pressures to maximise the organisation's benefits and so on, there are the human values. Now you can list those how you like. There are lots of different ways to list human values. But we don't disagree about these headline values. All of us, I think, would agree that honesty is an important value, that fairness and justice are important values, that caring for other people and respecting other people are important human values. And we can add to those. In some lists of values there are 60, 70, 120 different values, but they all flow out of these core human values. So this is not to say that any of what we're saying now is the law or it's the only way of looking at life. It's a suggestion that this is a proper way to look at life. Now, I also want to give you a couple of personal guidelines as criteria for ethical decision making. So a few people have come up with sets of about 4 or 5 criteria that they think it's good to keep in mind So I'm just going to share with you a couple that I particularly like. This one is from Mary Guy, who's written a book on ethical decision making at work, and she's an academic at Florida State University, and she says these things are useful guidelines. Consider the well-being of all stakeholders. And you know that I really like that, because my best definition of ethics is Albert Schweitzer, who talks about having regard for the well-being of others as his definition of ethics. So I like that as being the first guideline. Then she says, think as a member of the community, not just from your own individual perspective and not just from your organization's perspective either. Think that, so what she's saying is, first and foremost, you're a citizen of the earth. You're not just a hired gun for an organization, and you're not just selfish. Then she says, obey the law, but don't depend solely upon the law. Remember what I said before, that whenever a company is doing something that's morally dubious, they invariably say, we obeyed the law. So do not depend solely upon the fact that the action obeys the law or doesn't break the law. Then, another question I like that she puts is, what sort of person would do such a thing? This goes back to what I said in the beginning about decisions in contradistinction to relationships, that it's not just about actions, it's also about what do that say about people. So the question here is, what sort of person would do this thing that I'm contemplating? And then there's a cultural aspect. Respect the customs of others, but not at the expense of your own ethics. So this is back in that area of, there are some things about ethics that are my standards that I apply to myself, and there are other things that you think should apply to everyone. For example, we say you shouldn't kill people, so that's not just a standard I apply to myself, that's a standard that I know that we all apply to each other. So we respect the customs of others, but we still bear in mind what are our own ethical standards. So I think this is a good set, it touches a whole lot of bases. So it's a good set of guidelines. And there's another one. This is a different kind of approach. It's simpler and broader. It comes from the Ethics Resource Center in America, and it's a simple rule, a plus rule, P-L-U-S. So this is speaking to people in an organizational context, remember? So the P stands for policy. We consider, what are the policies of the organization that we work in? What are the policies and procedures? Is my action consistent with that? And second, the legal question. Is my proposed action acceptable under applicable laws and regulations? Then, thirdly, the universal question. Does my proposed action conform to universal principles and values, the human values that we talked about just before? And lastly, you have to ask the question about self. Does your proposed action satisfy your personal definition of what's good and right and fair? So that's another good simple rule, because it's simple to remember, P-L-U-S. And lastly, a summary. After thinking about this question of ethical decision making, I came up with these points that are 6 propositions about ethical decision making. So it's this. Firstly, to remember that all situations are subject to ethical scrutiny, even routine ones where we tend to operate from a script. Secondly, and it follows from the first, ethics must be integrated into all decision making, and not just to some questions that we deem to be ethically problematic. So whenever we're making a decision, Ethics should always be present. It's like the parrot on your shoulder. It's the observer. And if we're looking at the ethical decision-making process, then we need to remember that we're actually looking at two things. There's the process, what are the steps that we go through, and there are the criteria. What are the criteria that we are appealing to, on which we base our decision, the values and the principles. And then the distinction that we made between the rational and the intuitive models for decision making. And bear in mind that much of the decision making that we do tends to be the intuitive and expert-like process, rather than the detached, objective, data-based process that we pride ourselves on with the rational approach. So keep both of these things in mind, not just the rational, but the intuitive as well. And remember that a lot of ethical dilemmas are not ethical dilemmas because they're not really between two things that we're not sure about. Often we're in situations where the dilemma is simply we know what's right and wrong, but it's difficult to do because it could cause us harm. So ethical dilemmas are really about conflicts between ethical values, not between what's right and wrong because it's difficult to do. When it's difficult to do and there's personal risk involved, you just have to figure out a way to do it and get on with it. And also, lastly, decisions alone are not sufficient. When we're talking about ethics and we're talking about ethical decision making, remember that at the end of it, it's not academic. We actually have to go out and put it into practice. And this is not so easy.